Today we're going to talk about food and hunger. Hunger is rarely about not having enough food in the world. In fact, we often produce more than enough. The real issue is how food moves through economic, social, and environmental systems. By the end of this lecture, you'll understand how food security works, how hunger persists, and how environmental impacts are connected to what we eat. In this chapter, we'll cover the four pillars of food security, the different levels at which food security operates, the major challenges threatening it. We'll also discuss why food availability does not automatically mean people have access to food. We'll explore gender barriers, especially those faced by women, and then shift to food waste, where we look at where it happens, who produces the most, and what environmental costs are associated with food waste. In this chapter, we'll cover the four pillars of food security, the different levels at which food security operates, major challenges threatening it. We'll also discuss why food availability does not automatically mean people have access to food. We'll explore gender barriers, especially those faced by women, and then shift to food waste, where it happens, who produces the most, and what environmental costs are associated with food waste. Looking at levels of food security. Food security operates at many different levels. At the individual level, needs differ based on age, gender, and health conditions. For example, children, pregnant women, and elderly individuals have different nutritional requirements. At the household level, food security depends on income, purchasing power, and whether the family can grow their own food or not. At the national or global level, it involves agricultural production, trade policies, imports and exports, and economic stability. A country may produce enough food overall, yet certain households within that country can still experience hunger. There are many growing challenges for food security. As the global population continues to rise, that increases food demand. Crop pests and diseases threaten harvests, and invasive species can devastate agriculture. Declining soil fertility, water shortages, and environmental degradation can reduce productivity. Land competition is another issue. Land that's used for biofuel cannot simultaneously be used for crops that produce food. I experienced this while living in Nebraska, where you could drive for hours and see nothing but cornfields that were used for biofuel, and not a single field that was used for food. Additionally, underinvestment in agricultural research can limit things like innovation, and that can improve crop yield and their resilience. So over time, these pressures can make maintaining food security a lot more difficult. One example of agricultural threats is Bactrocera dorsalis, the oriental fruit fly, which infests hundreds of plant species and poses serious economic risk to farmers. When pests spread, entire harvests can be lost. In Florida, food insecurity data from the Florida Department of Health shows that even in developed regions, food insecurity persists. These examples remind us that food systems are vulnerable in biological and environmental and economic disruptions. Protecting crops and monitoring food insecurity trends are both essential components of maintaining that stability. Let's take a look at some statewide and county trends in Pinellas, Hillsborough, and Pasco. We can see before the pandemic, food insecurity rates were declining. This is because of post-recession era programs. These led to an increase in jobs, increased wages, more benefits such as SNAP, EBT, stimulus payments, school meal flexibility where children were getting more meals in schools, and expanded unemployment compensation. In 2019, Hillsborough experienced a slight population increase. It was a temporary one. It went up 18%, but almost immediately began to fall and normalized by 2021. So we do see an increase that went from about 12% food instability to 18% just in that year. After the pandemic, in 2021, we start to see increases in food insecurity. This has to do with inflation, end of pandemic era food assistance, increased housing costs, and instability in service sector jobs and tourism jobs. So when that money gets tied up in other places, or we don't have consistent incomes, people will often sacrifice food. They'll go without certain meals, they'll opt for less nutritious foods just to save money, and this causes an ongoing problem. It's important to understand that increasing food production alone does not solve hunger at all. A country can have full grocery stores and still have food insecure populations. Economic barriers, such as high food costs, transportation issues, such as not having truck routes that are delivering to isolated areas very frequently, and social inequality often prevent access. There's also something called hidden hunger. This occurs when people consume enough calories but lack essential micronutrients like iron, vitamin A, or iodine. This can lead to developmental issues, weaker immune systems, and long-term health problems. So food security is about quality and access, not just the quantity. Women face unique and often invisible barriers with food systems, and these barriers operate at cultural, economic, and structural levels. In some cultures, for example, social norms dictate that men and children eat first, while women eat last. If food is scarce, this means women may consistently receive smaller and smaller portions or less nutrient-dense foods. Imagine a household where there is only enough protein for one serving of meat. If that serving goes to the adult male because he's seen as the breadwinner, a pregnant woman in the same household may miss critical iron and protein intake during a time when her nutritional needs are actually higher. Over time, this can lead to anemia, low birth weights for infants, and long-term developmental consequences for the child. Land ownership is another major structural barrier. In many regions of sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, women make up a large percentage of the agricultural labor force, yet they legally own very little land. Without land titles, women can't access credit, agricultural loans, or government subsidies. For example, if a drought occurs and the government offers financial assistance to landowners, female farmers can be excluded entirely simply because their names are not on the deed. This limits their ability to invest in improved seeds, irrigation systems, or fertilizer, even though research shows that when women farmers have equal access to resources, crops can actually increase their yield significantly. Poverty also disproportionately affects women. Globally, women are more likely to work in informal or unstable jobs with lower wages. A single mother working hourly service jobs may face unstable income, limited childcare, and transportation barriers, all of which affect food access. Even in developed countries, women had a large portion of food insecure households. This isn't simply because of an agricultural issue, it's an economic one. Health crises further intensify these inequalities. During the HIV/AIDS epidemic in part of Africa, women often became primary caregivers for sick family members. This reduced the time they could spend farming or earning an income. In some cases, fields went uncultivated because labor was redirected towards caregiving. The result was reduced food production, lower household incomes, and increased vulnerability to hunger, all stemming from gendered expectations around care work. We can also look at more recent examples, such as the COVID-19 pandemic. Globally, women were more likely to leave the workforce to manage childcare when schools closed. Reduced income directly affected food purchasing power, and this shows how food security is tightly connected to broader social systems. Addressing gender inequality is not just a matter of fairness, it's a food security strategy. Studies consistently show that when women control more household income, not most of the household income, just more of it, a larger percentage is spent on food, healthcare, and education for children compared to when men control that same amount of income. For example, microfinance programs that provide small loans directly to women have been associated with improvements in child nutrition and school attendance. When women are healthier, have land rights, and earn stable incomes, entire households can benefit from this. Next, let's look at consumption versus availability. In the United States, we grow far more food than we consume. A useful analog is imagining all food produced as a loaf of bread. Only about half is actually eaten. Of that remaining half that becomes waste, just a few slices would be enough to meet the caloric needs of people experiencing food insecurity. So if we look at this image, we see that about half of the loaf gets wasted. If we think about the number of people that remain food insecure, it would only take 4 slices of bread to feed those people. So when we consider this, we waste so much food. But if we took even a small fraction of that wasted food and were able to divert it to those people that need it, we would still have a massive amount of food wasted. So where does most food loss and waste come from? Globally, fruits and vegetables account for the largest share of food loss and waste, often between 30 and 55%, depending on the region. These foods are highly perishable and easily damaged during transportation and storage. Grains are the next largest contributor, followed by meat, dairy, and seafood. However, as we'll see, percentages by weight does not always equal environmental impact. So which country produces the most food waste and loss? China produces the largest total amount of food waste and loss, followed by India, and then the United States ranks third. However, when we look at waste per person, the United States stands out. Although it represents less than 5% of the world's population, it contributes about 10% of global food waste. This makes the US per capita waste especially high, and it shows that our lifestyles and our consumption patterns are major drivers in that. So we talked about food wasted by type. Now we're going to look at energy wasted by food type. When food's wasted, all of that energy used to grow, process, refrigerate, and transport it is wasted as well. Meat has the highest energy waste because it requires feed crops, land, watering, and long production cycles. Dairy and eggs also have high energy footprints. In contrast, vegetables and fruits require much fewer, they still require quite a lot, but much fewer inputs per kilogram of weight. Importantly, much food waste occurs at the retail and consumer levels. This means households and grocery stores play major roles in reducing the environmental impacts. So things that we do at home, if we're not eating our leftover food, if we're letting fruits and vegetables go bad, if retailers purchase too much of a product and eventually it ends up producing rotten foods, or if you order too much meat and it has to be sold by a certain time. If it's not sold by that time, it has to be thrown away. Certain retailers have very specific policies to avoid pathogen contamination. So certain delis will require that packaging only be opened for a limited number of hours. If the product is not fully sold by then, the entire rest of that opened product has to be disposed of. So we have policy issues, we have inventory issues, and we have personal consumption issues. And these are just a handful of examples along the entire process of energy loss. So who produces the most food waste and loss in the US? In the US, consumers waste approximately 503 grams of food per person per day, more than any other global region. Higher income households tend to waste more food than lower income households. This wasted food represents lost croplands, fresh water, fertilizer, and increased greenhouse gas emissions. Reducing food waste at home through meal planning, proper storage, and understanding expiration labels could significantly reduce environmental strain. Expiration labeling is confusing. Most people assume these dates have to do with safety when they almost always have to do with quality. The US has no federal requirements for date labels on foods except infant formulas, which have to be discarded after its expiration date. All other labels, like sell by, best by, and use by, are created voluntarily by manufacturers and refer to expected quality, not safety. Because there's no national standard, states and manufacturers use different terms in different ways. Most states do not legally define these terms, which is why consumers see a mix of labels that often mean the same thing. This inconsistency can cause confusion and leads many people to throw away foods that are still perfectly safe. A large number of people throw away food after the date, believing that it's unsafe. But since most dates reflect that quality rather than the spoilage or contamination or any kind of damage, enormous amounts of edible food end up in landfills. These misunderstandings have caused a tremendous amount of food to be wasted each year. One solution that came about is a bipartisan bill, the Florida Date Labeling Act of 2025. And it aims to standardize labels nationally by using just two phrases. Best if used by would indicate a quality indicator, and used by would indicate a safety indicator. These would help reduce confusion and hopefully cut down on food waste. Next, we're going to look at the environmental footprint by supply chain level. Most environmental impacts occurred during primary production, which is farming. This stage uses the most land, fertilizer, pesticides, and water, and produces the majority of greenhouse gas emissions. However, when food is wasted at the consumer level, all those upstream resources have already been used. Throwing away food essentially wastes every input invested from farm to table. This is why reducing waste is one of the most immediate ways to reduce environmental impacts without increasing production. So which foods produce the highest emissions? Beef has the highest greenhouse emission per kilogram of any major food category. Usually it exceeds 25 to 35 kilograms of CO2 per kilogram of food. This is largely due to methane emissions from cattle and the land requirements that are needed to grow and feed those cattle. Poultry and dairy have moderate emissions, while plant-based foods like grains, fruits, and vegetables have much lower carbon footprints. So dietary choices have measurable climate impacts. What's important to emphasize here is that this information is not about telling people they have to completely eliminate foods they enjoy. Food is cultural, it's social and deeply personal. Families surround, their entire lives around food. A lot of times the family conversation only happens around dinner time or breakfast. Food is very important to us and it's important to enjoy it. But we can think of this a little more in terms of balance and frequency. For example, if you enjoy consuming beef, maybe instead of having it 5 times a week, reduce it to two. Or you could balance that out by, maybe having smaller portions, but adding in a couple, maybe some beans or lentils or another form of protein to kind of stretch it out. Some people enjoy doing meatless Mondays. Um, there's also another trend, some people call it flexitarian, where you're not fully vegetarian, but you're more plant forward. Those are options, and there's no perfect answer for everyone. People, you know, create lifestyle changes at different rates. So it's about having fun, experimenting, but most importantly, not wasting the food that you purchase. Next, we're going to look at fertilizer and pesticide use by end source. Most fertilizers and pesticides are used not on fruits and vegetables for direct human consumption, but on crops grown to feed livestock. This means animal agriculture indirectly drives significant chemical input. Nitrogen and phosphorus fertilizers, when over applied, contribute to water pollution and dead zones. Understanding where these inputs go helps explain why shifting dietary patterns or reducing meat consumption can significantly lower those environmental pressures. So if we have more cattle being grown to feed a larger portion of people, but we scale that back maybe 10%, that now means we have less fertilizer and pesticides being used in the land used to grow food for those livestock. So that reduction doesn't just apply to the CO2 output. It refers to all the resources being put into growing those particular foods.